Another blockbuster jobs report comes out, or is it incredibly manipulated by the government? Well, I'll let you be the judge as we get into it here. So Canada's economy posts jobs gain and unemployment drop, but trade uncertainty casts cloud for the Bank of Canada. So if we head on over to Canada's unemployment rate, you can see now for 2 months it's pedaled back a little bit, but it's still higher than it was in October 2024. So, the trend is upwards. Nothing goes up in a straight line. You're always going to have up and down within that. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. Plus, you always see these massive seasonal adjustments that happen in December and January due to the amount of temporary jobs and then the drop off in temporary jobs. So I tend to just not even believe these reports that come out for December and January, as I've said, every year, in fact. So if we actually go back and look at previous reports for January and December, you can see a blockbuster report was posted January 2023, and December 2022 is exactly the same thing as we're seeing right now, pretty much. If you go to 2024, it was another jobs gain, and December was much flatter than it was this year. And then this year, you've had a big jump in the jobs for December, and then you've also had a jump in the jobs for January. So very, very typical. And you can see that January 2022, there was a huge drop off in the jobs. Obviously, there was massive swings, as you can see there, which were due to the pandemic back then. So it's very different circumstances that we find ourselves in this time with the economy. So let's get into it here. This is from Statistics Canada themselves. So employment increased by 76,000 in January, and the employment rate rose 0.1 percentage points to 61.1%. The unemployment rate declined 0.1 percentage points to 6.6%. If you look at where the job gains were, they were mostly in Ontario, BC, and New Brunswick, and it says the other provinces were little changed in January. It's going to be really interesting to see what happens in February, March, April, when we're actually getting into those reports that are more accurate. They're still manipulated heavily and are just estimated numbers. They're not actual factual numbers. And then you've got the population estimate. So we know unemployment is way higher than they're actually saying it is. But you've got to look at this, because this is just hilarious and kind of sums up the Canadian economy. Employment in the public sector was little changed in January, but was up 107,000. Now, that doesn't mean a lot, but that's 2.4%. Whereas for the private sector, if you look year over year, yes, of course, it gained more jobs because it's a bigger sector, but it's growing at a much slower 1.6%. So obviously, if the government is growing quicker than the private sector, then that means red tape, bureaucracy, all those different things that actually hinder growth, hinder productivity for businesses are just going to be increasing, which is never a good sign. You'd actually want to see the opposite happening. Government is actually contracting whilst the private sector is expanding. But this is always the case in challenging economic times. The government comes in and they try and fill the gap where the economy declines. And of course, it doesn't work, and it comes with huge economic distortions, which is also what we're seeing here. So it's very interesting. It breaks down all the different sectors and what's happened there, and we'll get into that. So changing economic conditions can have an impact on the number of employees who intend to leave their job. As labor market conditions cool and the perceived likelihood of finding new employment decreases, employees may be more likely to seek stability in their current job. While the employment rate in Canada has declined in the last 2 months, it was higher in January 2025, 6.6%, than 12 months earlier. So just gives an idea of what's going on. It says workers less likely to report planning to leave their job compared with 12 months earlier, which is very, very interesting to say the least. So if you look at what's going on across the provinces here, Canada, you can see BC is pretty much flat. Alberta is flat too. You've got the unemployment rate that declined in Saskatchewan, flat in Manitoba, flat in Ontario, declined ever so slightly in Quebec, but mostly flat. Down in New Brunswick significantly, it's now 6.4%, down 1.3% from the prior month. And in PEI, it's also down 1.3%, which is pretty significant, to 7.2%. Nova Scotia at 5.9%, also down nearly 0.5%. And if you look at Newfoundland and Labrador, it's still going up, 10.6% unemployment in Newfoundland and Labrador. So challenging economic times definitely going on there. But the unemployment rate, if you look at Alberta, Ontario, even getting into the territory in BC, is pretty high. So you know that the economy isn't doing that great, especially if you've got your most populous province, which is Ontario, which is really struggling on the unemployment front. And then this came out as part of their report, which I thought was really interesting. Obviously, Trump has hit the pause on the tariffs for the next 30 days. They're going to try and work out some sort of deal. We'll see if that materializes. I mean, it looks likely at this point because we've just seen this being pushed back and pushed back and pushed back. And we've discussed the economic consequences would be catastrophic for the United States and Canada. And it would just be a dumb thing to do. So I'm very, very doubtful that it will actually ever happen. But anyway, it's incredibly interesting to look at the jobs by city that depend on manufacturing, so you know where is likely going to be most affected by the jobs decline if the tariffs were implemented. So if you take a look at this chart here, Toronto is number one. They have a massive amount of jobs that depend on manufacturing, 347,000 jobs, over 347,000 jobs. That's crazy. And then another place you wouldn't think it, Kitchener, Waterloo, Barrie, Ontario. You've got Lower Mainland, Southwest British Columbia as well, depending heavily on manufacturing jobs. Montreal, some other place which I'll probably butcher the name if I try and pronounce it, in Quebec. Hamilton, Niagara region, also a big region. Windsor, Ontario. London, Ontario. Calgary, Alberta, and Edmonton, Alberta, along with Winnipeg, Manitoba. So, you know, all these regions you got to be watching, because guess what's going to happen if these tariffs are implemented? And layoffs might even be happening just as a precautionary measure because of the tariffs. But also, what's really interesting to think about as well is obviously if these places depend heavily on manufacturing and the economy is slowing and the US economy is slowing as well, it's pretty obvious to see it's just the economy stronger than in Canada, then basically it means less manufacturing is going to happen and more likely layoffs, especially in these areas. And if you look at all these areas, pretty much all of them are in housing bubbles. Some of them, like Calgary and Edmonton, are still trying to rise, but are still massive housing bubbles. So it's really important to look at that. And obviously, what the mainstream media is talking about since this jobs report came out is basically the likelihood of the Bank of Canada not doing anything, not cutting interest rates any further. And I highly doubt that, because the Canadian economy is very, very weak. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to work it out. And we know that the Bank of Canada is not very strong anyways. They're definitely not a hawkish central bank by any stretch of the imagination. The Bank of Canada is fully aware of the debt levels and the fact that there's probably going to be a debt crisis, even though they're underestimating it, because you see, the Bank of Canada believes that by dropping interest rates, the economic activity and conditions are going to improve, which is totally false and has never happened anywhere. But this is what all these central banks believe, because they went to these Ivy League schools which teach them broken economics, and then they get paid hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars, to sit there and make the wrong decisions, which are obvious to even people like me and people like you. So, you know, it's very, very interesting what is happening, and the labor market is going to be increasingly interesting as we get past these months that are very highly manipulated by the government, like we know on this channel. So anyway, if you've enjoyed this video, I'd highly recommend that you check out this video here. And then if you're looking for a VPN and you also want to help support the channel, then please go to expressvpn.com/marketmania, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care, guys. Bye.